The chapel was empty except for two people who didn't know they belonged together. Richard Hayes stood in the doorway, his expensive suit wrinkled from another sleepless night. The small hospital chapel looked exactly as it had 3 years ago, when he'd buried his wife here. Exactly as it had 6 months ago, when he'd buried his son. But someone else was there now. A young woman, maybe 19 or 20, sat in the front pew. Her shoulders shook with silent sobs, and in her hands she clutched something small and silver. As Richard stepped closer, his breath caught. The object glinted under the dim chapel lights. It was a compass. An antique brass compass in a silver case. The same compass he'd given his son Daniel for his 18th birthday. "Excuse me," Richard's voice cracked. "Where did you get that?" The young woman jumped, spinning around. Her eyes were red and swollen, her cheeks streaked with tears. She looked terrified, like a deer caught in headlights. For a moment, neither spoke. Then she looked down at the compass in her hands. Someone gave it to me," she whispered. "Who?" Richard moved closer, his heart pounding. "Who gave that to you?" The young woman stood abruptly, clutching the compass to her chest. "I should go. I shouldn't be here." "Wait." Richard reached out but stopped himself. "Please, that compass belonged to my son. He died 6 months ago. I need to know how you got it." The words seemed to hit her like a physical blow. She stumbled backward, her hand finding the pew for support. "Daniel," she breathed. "Daniel Hayes. You're his father." Richard felt the world tilt. "How did you know my son?" Fresh tears spilled down her cheeks. "He saved my life. More than once." She looked up at him with desperate eyes. "Can we sit down? This is going to take a while to explain." They sat together in that quiet chapel, strangers bound by grief and a mystery neither understood yet. The young woman introduced herself as Sophie Chen. She was 19 years old, a college freshman studying biology. And for the past year, she'd met Daniel here, in this chapel, every Tuesday evening. "We'd talk," Sophie said, her voice barely above a whisper. "About everything. About school, about dreams, about life. He never told me his last name. I just knew him as Daniel." She turned the compass over in her hands. "He gave this to me 3 weeks before he died. Said it would always point me toward safety, toward home." Richard's throat tightened. Daniel had visited the hospital every Tuesday for physical therapy after his car accident. The accident that had damaged his heart beyond repair. The same heart condition that had taken him 6 months ago, waiting for a transplant that never came. "But why here?" Richard asked. "Why did you meet in a hospital chapel?" Sophie's face clouded. "Because I had nowhere else to go. I was living in my car, hiding from people who wanted to hurt me." She wrapped her arms around herself. "Daniel found me one night in the parking garage. I was crying, trying to figure out where to sleep. He brought me here, to the chapel. Said it was always open, always safe. He'd bring me food, blankets, books. He never asked questions. He just helped." Richard felt something crack inside his chest. That sounded exactly like Daniel. His son had always been that way, finding strays and helping them, whether it was an injured bird or a person in need. But why hadn't Daniel told him about Sophie? "I was supposed to meet him here that Tuesday," Sophie continued, "but he never showed up. I waited for hours, days, weeks." Tears rolled down her cheeks. "I found out 2 weeks later from a newspaper. Car accident. Dead at 23. I didn't even get to say goodbye." "Car accident?" Richard frowned. "No, Daniel died from heart failure. In this hospital, actually. The damage from his previous accident finally caught up with him." Sophie shook her head, confused. The newspaper said car accident. "I saved the article." She fumbled in her worn backpack and pulled out a folded, yellowed newspaper clipping. Richard took it with trembling hands. The headline made his blood run cold. "Local man, 23, dies in hit and run." But this wasn't Daniel's obituary. The photo showed a different young man. The date was wrong, the details all wrong. "Sophie," Richard said slowly, "this isn't my son. Who is this?" Her face went pale. "That's That's Daniel, the Daniel I knew. Unless. She grabbed her phone with shaking hands, pulling up social media. What did your son look like? Richard showed her a photo from his wallet. Daniel, smiling in his college graduation gown, that same compass visible on a chain around his neck. Sophie stared at the photo, then at the newspaper clipping, then back at the photo. I don't understand. The Daniel I knew was different. Darker hair, shorter, a scar on his left eyebrow. But he had the same compass. The exact same compass. Richard's mind raced. Something was very wrong here. Tell me everything about the Daniel you knew. Every detail. For the next hour, Sophie talked. She described a young man who'd appeared in her life during her darkest moment. She'd been trapped in a trafficking ring, brought to the States under false pretenses with promises of college and a better life. Instead, she'd been forced to work in illegal massage parlors, her passport confiscated, threatened with deportation, or worse if she tried to escape. I ran, Sophie said, her voice hollow. 6 months before I met Daniel. I'd been hiding ever since, sleeping in my car, working cash jobs under the table, terrified they'd find me. And they were looking. I could feel them getting closer. The Daniel she'd known had somehow understood without her explaining much. He'd helped her hide, given her money, connected her with lawyers who worked pro bono for trafficking victims. He'd been careful, secretive, always looking over his shoulder. He told me he was sick, Sophie said, that he didn't have much time. He said that's why he had to help me quickly, had to make sure I'd be safe before. She couldn't finish the sentence. Richard sat in stunned silence. This Daniel sounded like an elaborate lie, except for one thing, the compass. His son's compass, given on his 18th birthday, custom-made with an inscription inside the lid. Find your way home, Dad. May I see the compass again? Richard asked gently. Sophie handed it over. Richard opened the silver case with practiced fingers. Inside, engraved in his own handwriting, were those same words. This was definitely his son's compass. But how had it gotten to Sophie through a stranger who claimed to be Daniel, unless the stranger wasn't a stranger at all? Sophie, Richard said carefully, I think the Daniel you knew did know my son. Maybe they met during Daniel's hospital visits. Maybe my son asked this other man to help you when he knew he was dying. It was the only explanation that made sense, except it didn't fully make sense at all. But Sophie wasn't listening. She'd gone rigid, her eyes fixed on the chapel entrance. Oh God, she whispered. Oh God, no. Richard turned. A man stood in the doorway. Middle-aged, expensive suit, cold eyes. He smiled, but it was the smile of a predator who'd found his prey. Sophie Chen, the man said in accented English. You've been very difficult to find. You cost us a lot of money. Running away like that. Time to come home. Richard stood, placing himself between Sophie and the stranger. I don't know who you are, but you need to leave. Now, the man's smile widened. Richard Hayes. Yes, I know who you are. Restaurant magnate. Very rich, very influential. He took a step forward. This doesn't concern you. The girl owes a debt. She needs to come with me. She's not going anywhere, Richard said, his voice steel. The man's hand moved to his jacket, and Richard saw the outline of something metallic. A gun. His heart hammered, but he didn't move. Behind him, Sophie made a small, terrified sound. Mr. Hayes, the man said softly, I don't want trouble with you. You have money, connections, lawyers. I understand, but this girl is my property. She signed contracts. She owes us $30,000 in transport fees, housing, food. She will work it off. Or, he shrugged, there are other ways to recoup losses. Richard's mind worked frantically. His phone was in his pocket. The hospital security desk was just down the hall. But any sudden movement and this man might do something desperate. Then Sophie spoke, her voice shaking but clear. My name is Sophie Chen. I'm 19 years old, and I'm a human being, not property. You trafficked me here illegally. You stole my passport. You threatened to kill my family if I didn't work. And the only reason I'm alive right now is because someone believed I deserved better. The man's face hardened. Stupid girl. Who do you think? Hospital security to chapel. Code red, armed intruder. A calm, authoritative voice cut through the tension. Richard spun around. An elderly man in a janitor's uniform stood near the side door, speaking into a radio. Suspect is male, 5 to 10, black suit, possibly armed. Subject is threatening a young woman, and Richard Hayes. The trafficker cursed and bolted. Within seconds, the chapel flooded with security personnel. Richard caught Sophie as her knees gave out, supporting her weight as she sobbed against his shoulder. The janitor approached them, his weathered face kind. "You did good, miss," he said to Sophie. "Real good. Those security cameras got everything he said. That's evidence." Richard looked up at the camera mounted in the corner of the chapel, then back at the janitor. "How did you know to call security?" The old man smiled sadly. "Because I got a letter 6 months ago, telling me to watch out for a young woman who'd be coming here, grieving for someone named Daniel. The letter said if anyone ever threatened her, I should hit this emergency button right away." He pulled a small device from his pocket. Been carrying it ever since. Waiting. Richard's blood ran cold. "Who sent you that letter?" "Your son, Mr. Hayes. Daniel Hayes. He came to me about a week before he passed. Gave me a sealed envelope and made me promise not to open it unless something happened to him. When I read about his death, I opened it. Inside was cash, this emergency button, and instructions to watch over a young woman in danger." The janitor's eyes were gentle. "He was a good man, your boy. Thought of everything." Tears blurred Richard's vision. Daniel had known he was dying, had known Sophie would be vulnerable without him, so he'd set up protections, contingency plans, even from beyond the grave. But that still didn't explain the mystery of the other Daniel, the man who'd won Sophie's trust while carrying his son's compass. The police arrived within minutes. Sophie gave her statement, trembling but brave, while Richard stayed close. The detective taking notes was a woman in her 40s, sharp-eyed and efficient. When Sophie mentioned the other Daniel, the one who'd helped her, the detective's expression shifted. "Can you describe this man?" she asked. Sophie did, in detail. The detective pulled out her phone, scrolling through photos, then showed Sophie the screen. "Is this him?" Sophie gasped. "Yes, that's him. That's Daniel." The detective looked at Richard. "Mr. Hayes, do you know a man named Daniel Rivera? He was 26 years old, found dead in a hit-and-run 6 months ago. We've been investigating his death as a possible homicide related to human trafficking cases." Richard's world spun. "No, I don't know anyone by that name." "Daniel Rivera was an undercover private investigator," the detective explained. "He'd been working trafficking cases for 3 years, trying to help victims escape and gather evidence against the networks. He died the same week as your son, actually. We thought it was coincidence, but now..." She looked between Richard and Sophie. "How exactly did he get your son's compass?" That was the question. The question that would haunt Richard for the next 3 months as he became entangled in an investigation larger than he'd ever imagined. Sophie moved into his guest house, protected by security and lawyers Richard hired. She was brave and brilliant, giving testimony that helped police dismantle a trafficking network spanning 3 states. But Richard couldn't let go of the compass mystery. How had Daniel Rivera gotten Daniel Hayes' most precious possession? The 2 men had died within days of each other. There had to be a connection. He hired his own investigators. He combed through Daniel's hospital records, his phone logs, his laptop, and slowly, impossibly, a picture began to emerge. Daniel Hayes and Daniel Rivera had met in this very hospital. Daniel Rivera had been recovering from a beating he'd taken while extracting a trafficking victim. Daniel Hayes had been there for his regular cardiac checkup. They'd struck up a conversation in the waiting room. And when my Daniel learned what the other Daniel did for a living, he'd been fascinated. Richard found text messages his son had never mentioned. Conversations about justice, about helping people, about making a difference before time ran out. His son's medical condition had been a ticking time bomb. Daniel Hayes had known he had maybe a year, maybe less. He couldn't change his fate, but he could change someone else's. So he'd funded Daniel Rivera's operations, quietly, secretly funneling money through anonymous accounts. He'd provided resources, safe houses, legal contacts. And when Daniel Rivera had told him about Sophie Chen, a young woman trapped and terrified, Daniel Hayes had made a decision. "I want to help her," one text message read. "But I can't do it myself. I'm getting sicker. I won't be able to see it through." Daniel Rivera's response. "Then let me be you. Let me meet her as Daniel. Help her as if I were you. You can guide me remotely. She'll never have to know how ill you really are." It was crazy. It was beautiful. Two Daniels working together to save one life, sharing an identity because one of them was dying and the other was willing to risk everything. Richard found video logs, his son, recording messages for Sophie that Daniel Rivera would memorize and repeat, coaching him on what to say, how to help, how to give hope without making promises he couldn't keep. "Tell her she's worth saving." Daniel Hayes had recorded just 2 weeks before his death. His face was gaunt, his breathing labored. "Tell her that some people are good, that the world hasn't forgotten her, and if something happens to me before she's safe, give her my compass. Tell her it will always point her toward people who care." Richard cried watching those videos. His son, dying slowly, spending his last energy on saving a stranger. And Daniel Rivera, this brave investigator, had carried out every instruction until the traffickers caught up with him. They'd run him down in the street, left him dying in the gutter, all because he'd helped one girl escape. Both Daniels had sacrificed everything for Sophie, and she'd never known the truth. Richard told her everything one quiet evening, 3 months after that day in the chapel. They sat in his living room, the compass on the table between them. Sophie listened to it all, tears streaming down her face. "2 of them," she whispered. "There were 2 of them, working together, and I never knew." "They didn't want you to know," Richard said gently. "They wanted you to have hope, not guilt. They wanted you to survive." Sophie picked up the compass, holding it to her chest. "I should have known. I should have realized." "You couldn't have," Richard interrupted. "That was the whole point. They made it seamless. They protected you from knowing how much it cost them. But why?" Sophie looked at him with desperate eyes. "Why would strangers do this for me? I'm nobody. I'm just—" "You're not nobody," Richard said firmly. "You're a human being who deserved to be saved. That's what my son believed. That's what Daniel Rivera believed. And they were right." The police caught Sophie's traffickers 2 weeks later, using evidence Daniel Rivera had gathered before his death. The network collapsed, and 17 other victims were freed. Sophie testified at trial, brave and clear-eyed, and the ringleaders went to prison for decades. But something still nagged at Richard, a piece that didn't quite fit. He couldn't shake the feeling there was something more, something both Daniels had kept hidden, even in their private communications. The answer came from an unexpected source. Daniel Rivera's mother, a quiet woman named Carmen, reached out to Richard 6 months after everything had settled. She wanted to meet, she said. She had something to show him. They met at a coffee shop in downtown Boston. Carmen Rivera was in her 60s, with kind eyes and hands worn from years of hard work. She carried a small wooden box. "Thank you for meeting me," she said, her accent thick but her English clear. "I know this has been difficult for you, losing your son. It's been difficult for me too, losing mine." Richard nodded, unsure where this was going. Carmen opened the box. Inside were old photographs, letters, documents. "My son was adopted," she began. "I took him in when he was 3 years old. His birth mother had died, and there was no father listed. He came from foster care, from a system that had failed him." She pulled out a photograph. "This is the only picture we have from his birth family. It was in his file." Richard looked at the photo. A young woman, maybe 20, holding a newborn baby. The woman looked exhausted but happy, and there, in the background, slightly out of focus, was another child. A boy, perhaps 6 years old, with a bright smile. Richard's breath caught. The boy looked exactly like his son Daniel at that age. "I don't understand," Richard whispered. Carmen pulled out another document, a birth certificate, old and faded. Daniel Miguel Rivera, born June 3rd, 1998. Mother, Elena Rodriguez. Father, unknown. Then she pulled out a second document, this one more recent, a DNA test. My son had this done 2 months before he died, Carmen said quietly. I didn't know about it until I found it in his belongings. He'd sent in his DNA and paid extra for ancestry tracking. Richard took the paper with shaking hands. The results showed Daniel Rivera's ethnic background, his maternal lineage traced back through Mexico. But there was a note attached in Daniel Rivera's handwriting. 50% match found, sibling relationship confirmed. Daniel Hayes, Boston, MA Days, TT0. The world stopped spinning. They were brothers, Carmen said softly. Half-brothers. Same father, different mothers. Your son must have figured it out somehow. Maybe he did his own DNA test. Maybe he saw the similarities. But he found his brother, and he helped him, and they saved that girl together. Family. Richard couldn't speak, couldn't breathe. His son had found a brother he'd never known existed, and instead of telling Richard, instead of disrupting either of their lives, Daniel had simply chosen to help. To be a brother in the truest sense, supporting Daniel Rivera's dangerous work, funding it, protecting it, and when Daniel Hayes had known he was dying, he'd made sure his brother would be taken care of too. Richard's investigators had found anonymous payments made to legal defense funds, to Carmen Rivera's mortgage, to cover medical bills. All from his son's accounts, all carefully hidden. Mr. Hayes, Carmen said, I think your son was trying to protect you from pain. If you'd known about Daniel Rivera, you might have tried to stop him from his dangerous work. You might have felt guilty about the brother you didn't raise. So your son just quietly made sure we were okay, made sure my son had the resources to do the good work he believed in. Richard thought of his late wife, Elena. No, not Elena. But there had been another woman decades ago, before his marriage. A brief relationship when he was in college, a young woman named Elena Rodriguez. They'd parted ways amicably when she'd moved back to Mexico. He'd never known she'd been pregnant. His son had discovered this truth and carried it alone, not wanting to burden Richard with complicated emotions about the past. Instead, Daniel Hayes had simply embraced his brother and helped him change the world, one rescued victim at a time. Sophie, Richard said suddenly. Sophie needs to know. Carmen nodded. She deserves the whole truth. They told her together, the three of them sitting in Richard's living room. Sophie listened, her eyes growing wider with each revelation. When they finished, she was silent for a long moment. Then she opened the compass and looked at the inscription. Find your way home, she read aloud. He wasn't just talking about safety, was he? He was talking about family, about belonging. Richard understood then what his son had done. Daniel Hayes had given Sophie more than protection and resources. He'd given her an example of what family could be. Chosen, sacrificial, boundless. He'd shown her through his brother that families could form across impossible odds, that connection mattered more than blood. I want to do something, Sophie said, her voice stronger now. I want to help other victims, like both Daniels helped me. I want to continue their work. Richard smiled through his tears. Then we'll do it together. That was 18 months ago. Today, the Daniel Hayes Foundation operates safe houses in 12 states, helping trafficking victims escape and rebuild. Sophie runs the operations, fierce and compassionate, the compass always in her pocket. Carmen volunteers in the Boston location, offering motherly comfort to young women who've lost everything. And Richard finally understands what his wife had tried to tell him before she died. Daniel has such a big heart, she'd said. He's going to change lives. He had, in ways Richard had never imagined. The foundation's logo is a compass, pointing not north but toward a stylized home. Beneath it, two names, Daniel Hayes and Daniel Rivera. Brothers, heroes, gone but never forgotten. Richard visits the chapel every Tuesday evening. Sometimes Sophie joins him. Sometimes Carmen comes too. They sit in that quiet space where it all began, where a young woman's tears and an old man's grief collided to reveal a story of love that transcended death itself. The compass sits on the altar during these visits, catching the light, pointing toward something beyond geography, pointing toward the truth that had changed all their lives, that family isn't just who you're born to, but who you choose to save, and who chooses to save you in return. Sophie has a new dream now. She's studying law, planning to prosecute traffickers and advocate for victims' rights. She's no longer the terrified girl hiding in a hospital chapel. She's found her way home, just as both Daniels had promised she would. And sometimes, in the quiet of that chapel, Richard can almost feel his son's presence, can almost hear him saying what he'd always said when Richard worried too much. "Dad, I'm exactly where I'm supposed to be, doing exactly what I'm meant to do." Daniel had found his brother, saved a life, and brought together a family that never knew it was incomplete. His heart had failed him in the end, too damaged to keep beating. But the love it had contained, the compassion it had generated, that would go on forever. Richard touches the compass each time he visits, tracing the inscription his own hands had engraved years ago. Find your way home. His son had found his way, had helped his brother find his way, had guided Sophie to safety and family and purpose. And now, in that hospital chapel where grief and grace had intersected, Richard Hayes finally understood. Home was never just a place. It was the people who refused to let you face darkness alone. It was the strangers who became family. It was the love that two young men named Daniel had proven could transcend anything, even death itself. The compass needle trembles slightly in the chapel's stillness, catching the light, still pointing, still guiding, still showing the way home.